Hi, class. Today we're going to be talking about our next subject matter, which is Islamic art. This week is going to be a little bit of, today we're talking about Islamic art, and next class is going to be slightly different because we're going to be talking about West and Central Asian art. I'm making this division because really we're focusing on Islamic art in several different contexts. And the next class, we're talking about West and Central Asian art, which is going to focus on this geographic area that has a lot of different influences happening simultaneously, including Islamic art. So we're going to kind of set the stage for that type of art by discussing Islamic art. And then we're going to be focusing on this very cosmopolitan, very lots of things going on, lots of influences happening in this area of West and Central Asia. So they're going to be separate PowerPoint, separate topics, but they are highly intertwined and going to influence each other. So let's get started talking about Islamic art. All right, to get started, I want us to do a little bit of an activity to see that the works that we're discussing today are still very influenced by the things that we've been talking about up until this point. Specifically, last week we focused on Byzantine art, and I mentioned a couple of times of this influence of Islamic art and architecture having an influence on Byzantine art and vice versa. So here, I want us to do this little comparison between these two architectural spaces. Tell me if you see anything similar, anything different. Feel free to pause the video and do it on your own before we talk about it. I hope that you notice a couple of architectural features on the right, which is this new architecture that we haven't talked about yet, that you recognize. We see a dome. We've talked about several domes. We're seeing lots of arches. We've been talking about arches since ancient Rome. We see a lot of mosaic work that is going to be largely influenced by Byzantine art, which we're seeing on an example on the left, which is San Vitale, which we talked about last week, being located in Ravenna, Italy. We are on the right-hand side talking about or looking at an image of the Great Mosque of Selim II. So this is a mosque that is going to give us a great insight into this interaction between Byzantine art and Islamic art. You'll notice one significant difference between the two of these images is that on the left, we do see figures, we do see depictions of Christ and angels. On the right, you see no figures whatsoever. You're only seeing geometric designs and calligraphy being the artful uh, making of text, essentially. And that is going to play a really important part when we talk about Islamic art, and we'll get more into detail about that. So see if there's anything else you recognize, anything you want to make comparisons between these two as we move on. Before we get into the specifics of Islamic art and architecture, we need to talk about the origins of Islam and what Islam is, the foundations of Islam as a religion. So Islam is a religion that began with the Prophet Muhammad. So the Prophet Muhammad is a figure. He was born in the city of Mecca, Mecca now being synonymous with the most important holy city in the world for Muslims. The Prophet Muhammad received revelation, a vision um, through God, through Allah, Allah being God, the Arabic word for Allah. And he became this very important figure for developing and spreading this word about this religion and refocusing people's priorities in this area that he was preaching. So this religion started in the Arabian Peninsula. So Mecca is on the Arabian Peninsula. So this is a religion that's going to start there and then spread throughout the Middle East, and then it's going to make its way over to Western Europe, specifically in Spain. It's going to make its way all the way east into parts of Asia. So this becomes a very important religion worldwide, even to today. You know, so it's really important that we talk about this religion as and the art and architecture that's being created because it's going to have a huge influence on the way art and architecture is going to look not only in these areas but all over the world. Some of the important things to know about Islam is the first thing is that there is a holy text known as the Quran, which literally means recitation. It's believed to be the written record of things that Muhammad said in his life, important guiding principles and laws and ideas that are foundational to Islam as a religion for, to explain to Muslims how to be good worshipers, to be good Muslims. There's also the five pillars of Islam. These are these five pillars are really considered the most important concepts and facets to being a good Muslim. Each of them telling you kind of different things to do or focus on in your life to be a good disciple, to be a good Muslim. There's Shahada, which is to test. Oh, sorry. It's that testify that none has the right to be worshipped but Allah and Muhammad, his messenger. So there's basically this idea that there's no other gods, no other that the sole focus should be on God, Allah, and Muhammad as being his primary messenger. Salah is offering prayers 5 times a day. This is a very important part of the life of Muslims. This is also going to play a significant part in how art and architecture is organized because it's going to help facilitate this pillar of Islam. Zakat is almsgiving for charity. So this idea of being charitable, offering um, contributions to support the poor. Hajj, another really important pillar for us for our conversations we're going to be having about art and architecture. The Hajj is it's believed in the Islamic faith that Muslims must, in one time in their life, if they're financially and physically able to, must go visit Mecca, go perform the Hajj. The Hajj being a pilgrimage, traveling to Mecca, the holy city, the holy site, excuse me, in Islam, where Muhammad was born, where he received his initial revelation. And there's a whole slew of rituals that are involved with this. And we're going to talk more specifically about that because it's really fascinating, really important to the worldview and life of a Muslim person. And then fasting is another important part of pillar of Islam. So let's get into some more specifics. All right, let's talk about some specifics of early Islamic art. So when we think about Islam as a religion, in terms of early Islamic art, obviously the founding of Islam is going to be in the early 600s. So that's really when Islamic art is going to start and to start to proliferate. So Muhammad's teachings become highly influential and important to people all over the world of the Middle East, beginning in the Arabian Peninsula, spreading out into the northern parts of the middle or north of Arabia, all the way into Asia along the Silk Road, and then all the way westward into Europe, again, specifically in Spain. And there's kind of more about that we're going to talk about in a minute. There are Islamic dynasties that are known as caliphates. So essentially, sort of yeah, dynasties like families and people in power who pass power down between generations and between people that expand all over the Mediterranean as well as North Africa and West Asia. Around the mid 1200s, uh, there's some fighting between the Mongols and the Islamic people, the Muslims in this area, and essentially the Islamic world splits into Eastern denominations and Western denominations or regions, and this is going to split. Not only in terms of faith, how things are done, but obviously also how art and culture is practiced, and it's really going to be influenced by different things, respective to what's going on in those geographic regions. Now, because Islam is not a monolith, Islam, like pretty much any other world religion, when you say Christianity, there's Christians all over the world, there's Muslims all over the world, there's Jews all over the world, there are, you know, um, people practicing Hinduism all over the world, Buddhists all over the world. And a lot of that influence of how that is practiced is going to be influenced by what's going on in that particular geography. And so we're going to talk about that and look at some examples of that as we're talking about Islamic art. So again, Islamic art is not a monolith, but we will see some similarities, and we're going to account for those geographic differences of saying, this is Islamic art and this is what we can see similar to other Islamic art. However, it's being influenced by this particular geography, right? Um, yeah, so we're going to see influence from these other areas of the world. One big thing that I want to emphasize, and I've mentioned maybe a little bit already, is that in Islam, there is a big prohibition against the desecration of holy things, of sacred things. For example, Allah, Muhammad, humans in general oftentimes are considered to be too sacred to be desecrated. And when I put that in quotation because that's kind of a harsh word to use, but to be kind of put into the human world is a form of separating God or Muhammad or whatever from its holy status. So there is an avoidance of depicting particularly Allah and Muhammad in imagery. So you are not going to see images of God. You are not going to see images of Muhammad. That is seen as disrespectful to those figures. That extends even oftentimes into depictions of humans or animals. So, for the most part, and most especially in religious contexts, meaning like mosques, so like, worship places of worship, you will not see figures. You will not see depictions of God. You will not see depictions of Muhammad. Very different from, like Christianity, for example, right? Which is very often you see depictions of Jesus and saints and the Virgin Mary, right? Like you see those narratives. Images are really important to telling those narratives, right? That is not the case in Islam. That is seen as disrespectful. So you don't see that. You will see examples sometimes of humans being depicted, particularly for temporal things. And there are like a handful of exceptions that I've seen of depictions of Muhammad, but even that is like, even if that's done, oftentimes there will be like a flame of fire put over the face because it's just so like, depicting Muhammad would be so powerful that, you have to like cover it with the flame. So there are exceptions to this, but as a general rule, and never in a religious context, where, on architecture, let's say, or in a mosque, we're not going to see depictions of humans. That's just not going to happen. But again, we're going to see some exceptions to that. But because we don't see figures, what is being used? What is being depicted? Well, you're going to see a ton of geometry. You're going to see a lot of vegetal patterns. When I say vegetal patterns, it's going to be like, like vines intertwining and flowers and plants, things like that. You're going to see depictions like that. And a lot of use of calligraphy. Calligraphy, again, being the artful use of text or the artful design of text. And text is extremely important in the Islamic world. Specifically, words from the Quran are considered extremely important. So the artful incorporation of those texts in architecture is going to be heavily used. We're going to see a lot of really beautiful examples of that in the art and architecture we're going to look at. Here is a close-up of the map that I had on the previous slide, just to give us, again, a sense of like the geography that we're looking at. So you'll notice that this orangish tan area on the Arabian Peninsula is where Islam began. This is where Muhammad, so Mecca is where Muhammad was born, where he received his vision. As he was developing, kind of gaining political and religious power and all those things, they were actually, him and his followers were expelled from Mecca, ended up in Medina, which is another really important city site for the Islamic faith. And then over time, Islam just spread outward. So you have these territories in blue is where we first seeing it spread outside of the Arabian Peninsula, all the way into Persia, Syria, parts of northern Egypt. And then eventually over several other centuries, we have these other green parts being added. So we have this particular extension of the Islamic world, the Moors that go all the way to Spain, and to northern Africa. And we see this large influence of Muslims in Spain. We see them extending all the way out to the east into parts of Asia. And it's just going to kind of expand from there. And so you'll notice in the very center, we have the Byzantine Empire, which was where we talked about last week, which is where Christianity is centered. But you can see this really close, these territories are butting up against each other, right? So there's going to be influence, there's going to be trade, there's going to be fighting, there's going to be all of those things going on between these two important civilizations. Now, I want to show this great video that gets into the specifics about the complex geometry of Islamic design. So, I mentioned that we're not seeing a heavy emphasis on figuration, a heavy emphasis on like narrative. Um, it's particularly in religious spaces. We do see a little bit in non-religious spaces, but sacred geometry becomes really, really important in Islamic art and architecture, particularly through mosaics. This is a great video because it shows not only how these things come about and the designs of them, but also the lineage of where this comes from. A lot of these things are being established through Persian and Roman mosaics. A lot of influence coming from the Byzantine Empire. So, kind of like the very beginning slide that I showed you guys, these things aren't happening in a vacuum. It's that the people at this time were being influenced by these other things and applying it to a particular context that served the art and architecture for Muslims very well. So this is a great video. Let's watch.
In Islamic culture, geometry is everywhere. You can find it in mosques, madrasas, palaces, and private homes. This tradition began in the 8th century CE, during the early history of Islam, when craftsmen took pre-existing motifs from Roman and Persian cultures and developed them into new forms of visual expression. This period of history was a golden age of Islamic culture, during which many achievements of previous civilizations were preserved and further developed, resulting in fundamental advancements in scientific study and mathematics. Accompanying this was an increasingly sophisticated use of abstraction and complex geometry in Islamic art, from intricate floral motifs adorning carpets and textiles to patterns of tilework that seemed to repeat infinitely, inspiring wonder and contemplation of eternal order. Despite the remarkable complexity of these designs, they can be created with just a compass to draw circles and a ruler to make lines within them. And from these simple tools emerges a kaleidoscopic multiplicity of patterns. So how does that work? Well, everything starts with a circle. The first major decision is, how will you divide it up? Most patterns split the circle into 4, 5, or 6 equal sections, and each division gives rise to distinctive patterns. There's an easy way to determine whether any pattern is based on 4-fold, 5-fold, or 6-fold symmetry. Most contain stars surrounded by petal shapes. Counting the number of rays on a starburst, or the number of petals around it, tells us what category the pattern falls into. A star with 6 rays, or surrounded by 6 petals, belongs in the 6-fold category. One with 8 petals is part of the 4-fold category, and so on. There's another secret ingredient in these designs, an underlying grid. Invisible but essential to every pattern, the grid helps determine the scale of the composition before work begins, keeps the pattern accurate, and facilitates the invention of incredible new patterns. Let's look at an example of how these elements come together. We'll start with a circle within a square and divide it into 8 equal parts. We can then draw a pair of crisscrossing lines and overlay them with another 2. These lines are called construction lines, and by choosing a set of their segments, we'll form the basis of our repeating pattern. Many different designs are possible from the same construction lines, just by picking different segments. And the full pattern finally emerges when we create a grid with many repetitions of this one tile, in a process called tessellation. By choosing a different set of construction lines, we might have created this pattern, or this one. The possibilities are virtually endless. We can follow the same steps to create 6-fold patterns. By drawing construction lines over a circle divided into 6 parts and then tessellating it, we can make something like this. Here's another 6-fold pattern that has appeared across the centuries and all over the Islamic world, including Marrakesh, Agra, Konya, and the Alhambra. 4-fold patterns fit in a square grid, and 6-fold patterns in a hexagonal grid. 5-fold patterns, however, are more challenging to tessellate because pentagons don't neatly fill a surface. So instead of just creating a pattern in a pentagon, other shapes have to be added to make something that is repeatable, resulting in patterns that may seem confoundingly complex but are still relatively simple to create. Also, tessellation is not constrained to simple geometric shapes, as M.C. Escher's work demonstrates. And while the Islamic geometric design tradition doesn't tend to employ elements like fish and faces, it does sometimes make use of multiple shapes to craft complex patterns. This more than 1,000-year-old tradition has wielded basic geometry to produce works that are intricate, decorative, and pleasing to the eye. And these craftsmen prove just how much is possible with some artistic intuition, creativity, dedication, and a great compass and ruler.
All right, we're going to start our focus on Islamic art um, and architecture. We're gonna look at parts of Spain that were influenced by art and architecture. So when we look at medieval Islam, for the last couple of weeks, we've talked about this idea of the fall of the Roman Empire, the rise of the Byzantine Empire, but a lot of parts of Western Europe were in chaos, kind of changing hands, different civilizations conquering these different areas. And one of those areas is Spain being conquered by the Moors, which is one of the groups of Muslims that were, growing in power at this time. And one of the reasons this is so interesting and important to talk about is because Spain becomes the center of Islam and then eventually becomes reconquered gets conquered by Christians. But despite that fact, we have this huge Muslim influence here. Even if you look at contemporary Spain, there's so much influence from Islamic art and architecture that now kind of just is perceived as like Spanish art and architecture, when in reality is really rooted in Islamic traditions. And so we're going to see some examples of that. Even the language, even Spanish as a language was largely inspired by the Moors. So there's a lot of words in Spanish that come from Arabic. I feel like I used to know more examples, but like I think like azúcar, I know that's like the first one that came to mind, like sugar. That's an Arabic word, and it's like etymologically it came from Arabic. Islam also makes its way to Turkey eventually, and they conquer the city of Constantinople. And we talked about that when we talked about the Byzantine Empire, that eventually the Byzantine Empire falls with the conquering of the is you know these Islamic caliphates take over Constantinople, turn it into Istanbul, and it still currently is considered to be like a largely Islamic place. And Turkey is considered to be part of this like Islamic diaspora, this place where Muslims occupied and I shouldn't say occupied, lived and were heavily influencing what was going on culturally speaking. All right. An important aspect of Islamic art and architecture is we're going to talk about the construction of a mosque. So we talked in the last couple of weeks about construction of, let's say, like a Christian architecture, and we talked about different plans that, every church is like slightly different, but generally speaking, you're going to see an apse, which is where the altar is. You're going to see a transept. You're going to see a nave. You're going to see aisles and narthex, right? Like there's these basic parts that traditionally you're going to see in any plan. So we're going to do the same thing for mosque architecture. So I want you to be able to we're going to look at several mosques in the next couple of weeks, and I want you to be able to identify its most important inherent parts that make it a mosque. So I have these words highlighted and they correspond to the parts of the diagram so you can see exactly what I'm referring to. So the first one I wanted to point out is the mihrab. Mihrab is extremely important in the construction of the mosque because it is always located on the Qibla wall. A Qibla wall is going to be a wall that is facing in the direction towards Mecca. So one of the five pillars of Islam I mentioned is prayer. So praying 5 times a day is an extremely important part of the daily routine of Muslim people. And so when you pray, you are the intent is that you're facing in the direction of Mecca. So the construction of a temple is going to be oftentimes I don't want to say manipulated, but designed to face towards Mecca, whether you're south of Mecca and you need to point north, or if you're west and you need to point east, or if you're east and you need to point west, right? It's just going to always face the direction of Mecca. So the mihrab is going to be this niche, this archway that's kind of carved out into the wall that points a person towards Mecca. So you know when you pray that you look at the mihrab, which is on the Qibla wall, and you know that you're facing the correct direction. A minaret is a common feature in mosques. A minaret is typically going to be a tower that is going to be where prayer calls are sounded. It's basically in the past it was a person that would call out the 5 times a day to do your prayers. So that's going to be an important, and acoustically, it makes sense because that's, if you're high up, you can project your voice. Nowadays, you don't have to have something like that, but that's still like a traditional part of mosque structures. Often you're going to have an ablution fountain or a wudu area. This is basically like a water feature that is meant to deliver water for ritual washing and cleansing. Um, Before prayer. Minbars are common in mosques as well. These are essentially pulpits. This is where a person can go up, known as an imam, is a person that essentially can give, speeches, give, pontifications about religion. And imams are basically like religious leaders that offer guidance and speak to congregants essentially. And then another important part of mosques, oftentimes are courtyards, are also known as sawns. That's the Arabic word for it. It's a courtyard is essentially just this out exterior area that is often with like plants and trees and light can be let in. It's an exterior, I mean, exterior space in the sense that like the elements are exposed to it because there's not a roof, but it's still typically a courtyard, like it's enclosed by like a colonnade or some sort of wall structure. All right, the last technical element that I want to explain before we look at examples of Islamic architecture is the idea of a dome on a pendentive versus a dome on a squinch. So, squinch is a great word. I don't know, I like saying that, but we talked in the last several weeks about domes and domes being important construction, like a innovation in architecture. It creates these really beautiful, um, you know, this beautiful architectural feature that makes a work of architecture awe-inspiring, tall, lots of interior airy space. And so we see that carry through from the Romans into the Byzantine Empire. And the Byzantine Empire, what they do is they take the dome and instead of making like a square structure underneath, or not a square structure, like a circular structure underneath, which is typically what they would do, they developed what's a dome on a pendentive, which basically is you have a dome and then you have these Roman arches underneath that have these pendentives attached to offer the support. Now, Islamic architecture is going to similarly really find domes useful and create really spectacular architectural spaces, but instead of putting domes on pendentives, they are going to have a design where they have domes on basically square drums. Like, so you have the dome and then you have this square structure that the dome is sitting on top of. And then they create these squinches, which are the areas that connect the drum of the dome to the vaulting on the bottom, to the Roman arches on the bottom. So it's similar to a pendentive. It functions in the way of a pendentive, that it connects the supporting structure to the dome, but you have less of like a curved structure. It's a little bit the squinches are smaller and connected just in a different way. And you don't need to know like really specifics about that, but just know that there's a difference between these two and that you can visually see them. If you see a dome on a pendentive versus a squinch, they look different. All right, we're going to look at our first architecture as an example of Islamic architecture. This space is really interesting because, like a lot of the spaces we've talked about and we will continue to talk about, this changes hands over time. So the actual construction we're seeing here is on the site that was, wait for it, originally a pagan temple, converted into a Christian church, and then the time period we're going to focus on is then Islamic, basically the Umayyad dynasty is going to move in. So this Islamic empire is going to be in charge, turn it into a mosque. It eventually gets taken back into the hands of Christians and converted into a Christian church. So over time, we see this, change over and over and over again. But the largest influence, or like the most evident influence of architecture and the construction as we see it today, is largely from expansions made by the Umayyad dynasty, or Umayyad Caliphate, I should say. So we're going to talk about that. So I want you to take a minute and, maybe refer back to the diagram I showed you of a mosque. Do you see anything here familiar to you? Any guesses you can make as to the parts of this area? Maybe take a second pause, refer to those two, see if you can find anything. A couple of things that I'll point out that I hope you notice is first of a huge courtyard area, right? The San, very emblematic of a mosque, of mosque architecture. Very often we're going to see this large courtyard. So this is the San or the courtyard. You'll also notice in the San or courtyard, there's a large tower. That is a minaret. This is originally where the prayers would have been called. Since it became a Christian church, would have been transformed into a bell tower. So now it serves the purpose of like a Christian church, but originally would have been constructed as a mosque or a minaret, excuse me. And then the last feature I want to point out that might be hard to, well, two features I want to point out is if you look at the very sort of bottom part, you'll notice that there's a dome right on the edge of a wall. And that dome is on top of a very important part of the mosque structure, which is the mihrab. So remember, the mihrab is on the Qibla wall. The Qibla wall is the wall that faces Mecca. Interestingly enough, this is a very rare exception to the rule that typically the mihrab points in the direction of Mecca. This one actually points in the direction of Damascus. And the reason it points in the direction of Damascus is because basically the people that are here that built this out were kicked out of Damascus. So this was sort of like paying homage to their homeland. But that's an exception to the rule. Typically the Qibla wall and the mihrab are going to point in the direction of Mecca. And then the last thing I want to point out is in the very center, very oddly and kind of funnily added much later, is you'll notice like this big roof and then another dome structure and then a cross structure, which is a transept. If that gives you a hint, there is a Christian church that was kind of popped right in the middle on top to indicate that this was a Christian church or converted into a Christian church. So you have this large mosque and sort of this funny Christian church that's been added. And so you can see that cross structure. So you see this layering, which is really interesting. But we're going to look at some more specific photos and see the interior of the space. So here's another picture to give you a sense of what the interior of this mosque looks like. I hope the word hypostal hall is familiar to you. If you remember in the last couple of weeks, we talked about this idea of a hypostal hall, which is essentially a large space that has a lot of columns supporting it in order to give it height because otherwise the roof would collapse in. So here you're seeing a ton of columns and all of those columns are supporting this larger structure. Interestingly enough, too, you'll notice that these columns are fairly thin and they're actually old looking because they are spolia. I've used that word before. Spolia is when you take something art or architectural from another context and repurpose it for another context as a way of sort of showing dominance over it. So these columns were taken from another structure um, to show the power of the Islamic world at this moment. We're going to talk a little bit more about these archways and what they represent in a couple of slides. I have another picture. So this is the Great Mosque of Cordoba, also known as La Mezquita. La Mezquita just means the mosque. So this is like the mosque, the most important mosque, or was considered the most important mosque in Cordoba or in Spain at this time. So this was built out by Umayyad exiles. So the Umayyads are basically this dynasty, this group that came from Damascus. They were kicked out, and there were already Islamic people, the Moors occupying this area, and then the Umayyads came in and sort of took over like leadership. And they built this mosque over the church, which the church was built on top of a pagan temple. So again, it was reconverted into a Christian church later. The mosque is a hypostal hall, which we've talked about. And then we have the mihrab, which again, we have a dome on top of which we're going to look at in just a minute, and then elaborately decorated squinches, which remember the squinches are sort of like that area that connects the dome to the wall supporting structure underneath. I mentioned that the mihrab faces towards Damascus. The ceilings were originally flat and wooden, but now they've been vaulted, so we don't we don't have to concern ourselves with that. With that, we, if we had time, we could talk more specifically about that. And one of the things that the La Mesquita is known for is our orange trees in the San, which the orange trees actually would not have originally been here. They would have been brought in to remind the Umayyad prince of his home. This was something, he really resented the fact that he was kicked out of his home. So he built out many of the he really tried to build a place that would remind him of his where he came from. Here is a diagram to show you these different parts, where things are. We have the minaret, which is on the outside of the courtyard. Then we have the Christian chapel, which is at sort of in the center of the hypostal, the hall area. And then we have the dome containing the mihrab on the very, on the other wall. Here are some more images just to give you a sense of some other elements that are inspired by the existing civilizations here. We have double arched columns, which we looked at with these, red and white alternating stones. These are meant to add lightness and make it look airy and taller, even though you still had to have all of these columns to support the height of the building. The alternating colors of the stones are known as voussoirs. These are just meant to highlight the structure and just kind of show this like organization. And this you're going to see very common in Islamic architectures, particularly in Spain. It becomes very emblematic in Spain. This horseshoe shaped arch, which we've talked about Roman arches, which is just sort of this kind of shape. But when we're talking about a horseshoe arch, we're basically looking at an arch that like tapers in and then goes out again. So that is inspired by Visigothic architecture. The Visigoths are the people that were occupying this area before the Moors came in. So we're seeing an inclusion of this as well. Um, we will see this arch shape influencing other mosques later. And we also see Kufic calligraphy, which is kind of hard to tell here, but there is Kufic calligraphy on the exterior, which again emphasizes this idea that we don't have imagery or narrative imagery, but we do have the inclusion of text. Here's some other really fantastic photos of the space to show you what it looks like. You have the San. You have on the bottom here, I have like a close-up of the mosaics to show how beautifully done this like gold work mosaic is. Lots of geometric shapes, vegetal patterns. And you'll notice here in the sort of like bluish mosaic tiles and gold, it's kind of hard to tell at first, but that is Kufic calligraphy. That is text being shown here. Again, which is just like a really fantastic, just beautiful, skillful element to add. And then this picture I have on the right is an image of the dome that occupies the area right above the mihrab. So the mihrab is here at the bottom. We have a Visigothic arch. Um, uh, Outlining or framing this niche, which is the pointing you for prayers, in this case towards Damascus, adorned in gold, evoking not Gothic, excuse me, Byzantine mosaics, as well as calligraphy being included. And then we see the dome being supported by these crisscrossing ribs, and then we have these squinches, which are kind of hard to tell here, but they're there. All right, the next object we're going to look at is another example of Islamic art. This is also an object that was found in Spain. It's a relatively small object. It's about 6 inches tall and 5 inches in diameter, so it's fairly small. And part of the reason it's so small is because it's made of a material known as ivory. Ivory is material that is typically taken from like a elephant tusk or any animal with like a tusk. Those tusks are known as ivory. So taking something like that, which is a material relatively easy to work with and to carve into, but of course you're limited by the size that it comes in, which is usually going to be relatively small. And obviously that's also a material that doesn't exist, you know, endlessly. So it's also considered quite a luxurious, and when I say luxurious, like hard to get material to make something. The object itself has a lid and a container that can be put on and taken off. So again, it's something small, handheld, portable, something that could have been used in traveling and things like that. One thing you'll also notice about this object is that it is highly decorated, right? Like it is absolutely filled top to bottom with decoration, with inscriptions, with incisions of images, and there's lots of images and lots of symbols here. I'm going to point out some of the symbols. There's more if you're welcome to look up like the other ones that I don't talk about, but there's imagery here that is going to tell very specific uh, narratives around particular rulers and leadership, which also gives us a good indication of, who used this, why they used it. You'll notice on the image on the left, you have two people on horseback, and they are reaching up and taking dates from a date palm. So basically, like these fruits from this tree. And then on the right hand side, you have two figures who are collecting eggs from falcons' nests. Now, on a surface level, that's just kind of like random objects and symbols. But we do know that the symbols that we're actually seeing, for example, the falcons are a symbol often associated with the Umayyad Empire. And this object is related to the Umayyad Empire specifically because the person that owned this object or who was given this object is Al-Mughira, who is essentially a prince of the Umayyad Empire. On the left side, you see this image of the date palms and the horses, and the date palm was associated with the Abbasid Empire, which is another sort of rival empire to the Umayyads. And so them picking the dates is a form of showing superiority over that empire. So there's other symbols here, but essentially this is telling a story of sort of propagandistic story upholding the Umayyad Empire as, the superior empire. Some other facets of this, I mentioned that it's made of ivory. There are also traces of jade, which is a precious material that probably would have been taken out since then, but we do know that this might have been inlaid with other precious stones. There's also calligraphic inscription, which is around the edges of this lid that you can notice. This is in, again, this like artful inclusion of text that's actually telling us that this is an object for Al-Mughira. It's giving Allah's blessing, and it's essentially telling us who owns this and that this is a person of religious faith that they wanted to associate with Allah. We believe that this was an object that was gifted to the son, so the caliph's son, so basically the again like the prince equivalent in this type of empire structure. And we believe that this would have originally held aromatics like perfumes and incense that could be carried and taken with him. Again, perfumes and incenses would have themselves been luxury objects. So just showing wealth and power through these, owning important, expensive things. So oftentimes these type of gifts were relatively, this was something very common for people in the caliphs to own and to exchange with other people in other empires, with Christian rulers as a way of like goodwill or marking a special occasion, something like that. So we believe that this would have been something given to the caliph's son when he turned 18, because that's around the time that he received it, which would have been a big age for the prince. This object also describes a term that is used often in art history that I do want you to know because it is very common in Islamic art, which is horror vacui. It literally means the fear of empty space. And it's anytime you see an object or an image or anything like that, that top to bottom, every corner is filled with some sort of inscription, design, something. So it's this idea that the entire thing is adorned. It's this, again, expression of luxury, the expression that something is so detailed and, it's small, right? So it's showing that not only is it something valuable, but it's like even the small things I own are valuable and luxurious, right? We also have inclusions of geometric and floral forms, juxtaposition of organic and geometric designs. Now, remember, one of the things we've talked about a lot is this idea that in Islamic art, specifically religious Islamic art, we're not seeing narrative scenes, right? We're not seeing people often, we're not seeing specifically not spiritual figures, but this is going to be an example of where there's sort of exceptions to that rule. This is a very temporal object, meaning like not specifically connected to some sort of spiritual activity, despite the fact that it does include the name of Allah, which again, not a depiction of Allah, but the name Allah, which is in the calligraphy. So this would be an exception to that. But even though we do have figures and narrative and we have symbols here, we still see a lot of emphasis on design and geometric forms, inorganic and organic geometric forms. And I mentioned the date palms and the eggs in the falcon's nest, which are have these symbolisms that give it this propagandistic, showing the superiority of the empire to it. We also have flower-shaped medallions on the base and lid that show activities that would have been probably popular in the royal courts, maybe specifically for Al-Mughira himself. Maybe it was like his favorite things to do, which include falconry, hunting, sports, and music. All right, our next example of Islamic architecture is going to be our last example of Islamic architecture in Spain. And then we're going to move more towards the east. We're going to talk about architecture in Turkey and then eventually move our way more into the Middle East and into the parts of Asia. So the image that we're seeing here is the structure known as Alhambra. Now, Alhambra comes from the term Qal'at al-Hamra, which translates to red fort. So this structure was specifically designed originally to be a like military complex, a fortification essentially to protect the city. So the complex itself, the whole structure is surrounded by a wall that's a mile long and it's on top of a hill. So it functions really well from a military perspective and it can be closed off very easily in the event of attack. So it puts you above and then if someone is trying to attack you, you can see them from above and you can close things off. And there's three purposes of this structure that over time sort of developed. So first, it started as a military fortification, which was well, let me just include all three. So this was first a fortification, which turned into a palatial complex and then turned into a residence. So essentially, this is a place where soldiers and military first started to, fortify the city, and eventually also became the home for a lot of the sultans and their families. So a place for uh, political function as well as like a residence for the sultans. It was extremely elaborately outfitted and lavishly outfitted, meaning that it has a lot of you know decor. It's meant to be an impressive site. There's lots of courtyards and fountains and a lot of water. Water has a lot of associations with like paradise in Islam. So anytime you have inclusion of like pools and gardens, that's going to have these like heavenly connotations. And it's quite hot in Spain, so these also are kind of just functional to be places that are a little cooler. There's a lot of intricately sculpted areas in the ceilings, and we're going to talk about muqarnas in a minute. I have some other pictures that we'll show. But the structure is very interesting and important because I mentioned this a couple times, but the fact is that Islamic architecture really started in the Middle East, but because we have this Islamic influence in Spain, there's going to be Islamic influence on the type of architecture that gets developed and the type of art that gets created. And then eventually when there's Christian and the Christian empire essentially takes over again Spain, they're still using a lot of these styles as, what becomes emblematic of Spanish art and architecture. So a lot of contemporary Spanish art and architecture or the art and architecture we see even from the times that the Christians are in charge of Spain, still incorporate a lot of these elements from Islamic architecture, even if it's not necessarily associated with like an Islamic building or something. These are two examples of areas of Alhambra. You have the Hall of Sisters, where you have 16 windows with thousands of muqarnas. Now, muqarnas, we're going to see like a lot of really cool examples of this. Muqarnas are basically these tiny little niches that are carved in over and over and over again to give this sense almost like like geodes or like almost like you're like in a cave or something. It's these really beautiful niches that become carved out. It creates this abstract patterning, but there's still an order to it. It's really this very interesting. Sorry, my camera went out. Um, Very interesting design that becomes common in Islamic architecture. The other area that I have here is the Court of the Lions. This is a courtyard area. And remember, we talked about this in Islamic architecture in mosque structures. It's not my camera, it's my light. We have these mosque structures that often have large outdoor courtyard areas with incorporated fountains that have religious significance because it's part of this like washing, purifying gesture. But this is also very common in non-religious spaces. So you have this open courtyard, access to the outdoors, fountains, again, associations with paradise. This one is called the Court of the Lions because there are several lion statues here, but it just shows again like how intricately detailed these spaces are. And one of the attributes of Alhambra that is pretty unique is that there are lots of columns. That becomes very common in Islamic architecture, borrowed from art architecture that had been developed by like the Romans into the Byzantine Empire. But the thing that differentiates these ones that they're quite thin, that becomes common in Spain too, that as architecture develops is these really thin structures giving it this airiness to the space. Here's another picture again, these huge water pools that give it the reflective reflect the light, but again, this water reflective of this idea of paradise. And here's another example of a courtyard. And here's a close-up of the Court of the Lions. And that's all of our images from Alhambra. Now we're going to move on to our next work of architecture. All right, this is our last work of architecture we're going to talk about for this PowerPoint. We have done a little bit of an analysis on this, or I invited you to do a comparison of this dome to the dome in San Vitale to see comparisons, similarities, differences. Here, you'll also notice on the left that this hopefully looks a little familiar to another architectural work that we've looked at least from the exterior, and that is the Hagia Sophia. And we'll talk about why that is, because that is very purposeful. So if we're looking at the location of this architectural structure that we're looking at, it is located in Edirne, Turkey. So you'll notice in this image, so Edirne is here, very much on the western side of Turkey, and then Istanbul, or as it was previously known, Constantinople, is just east of Edirne, okay? So at this point in history, when this mosque that we're looking at gets constructed, the Ottoman Empire, or basically a Muslim empire, had conquered this area. So Constantinople, previously the center of the Byzantine Empire, is turned over to a pretty much an Islamic empire, and Istanbul or Constantinople becomes Istanbul. All right. So this mosque gets constructed in Edirne, and specifically the attempt that is being made by the Sultan who commissioned this, who we'll talk about in just a second, was to create a structure that was awe-inspiring to people from the West who are traveling from the West to the East, potentially on their way to Istanbul, and to have this first, big architectural structure to be this outstanding example of Islamic architecture. So this is the Mosque of Selim II. Selim II was a sultan of the Ottoman Empire, and he wanted to have this huge structure built to surpass the Hagia Sophia. Even though Hagia Sophia was at this point turned into a mosque, this was supposed to be in competition with that structure. So it looks very much like the structure. However, it is ever so slightly bigger, not much, much bigger, but ever so slightly bigger. That was very important to Selim II. So it was inspired by the Hagia Sophia. Hopefully you can tell by this large dome. You have the fairly plain exterior, which is similar to the Hagia Sophia. We have tall minarets, and then the entire interior space is illuminated by really large windows, which was trying to emulate some of the elements of the Hagia Sophia. There are these hidden buttresses. They're kind of hard to tell here, but basically these supports on the exterior of the space to be able to hold up this ginormous dome. So you have these 8 piers, which are these 8 buttresses that are holding it up, resting on square sets of walls. So again, we looked at this before, that you basically have these square supports, and then the dome that's sitting on top, and then you have the squinches, which are going to be the things that are connecting, as opposed to the pendentives, which is what we saw in the Hagia Sophia. It's an octagonal shape. It's meant to be constructed similar to the Hagia Sophia as being a centrally planned building, but in an octagon shape. And then in the squinches, which are these connecting areas between the rectangular walls that are holding up the dome, or not the square sets of walls that are holding up the dome. The squinches themselves are filled with muqarnas, and we're going to look at really cool examples or like details of that. Sinan, who is the architect of this space, was commissioned essentially to build something more grand than the Hagia Sophia. So this is again ever so slightly larger. And the entire complex is also fairly large. The very center part is the mosque structure, and we know that because we have a minaret, we have the on the Qibla wall, we have the minarets, we have the mihrab, which is connected to the Qibla wall, which is facing towards Mecca, which is where prayers are performed. However, on the exterior of the space, there are complexes of that are meant to provide public services. So there's places for prayer and ablution. There's library, there's shops, a hospital, lots of different spaces here to perform different functions for the community. This is more open and less segmented than a typical mosque is. And the interior really gives you that sense. We'll look at it at an image where the dome is. It's a very large, airy space. This is the dome. The prayer hall is highly decorated with lots of mosaics. You can tell that there's, again, no narrative scenes here. There's no figures. There's no animals or anything like that. It's all geometric designs and floral design or sort of vegetal patterns. And all of these things are meant to convey this order, this unity, highly spiritual ideas that, God has ordered the universe, Allah has ordered the universe to be organized, but there's no depictions of humans. And then lots of calligraphy. You notice in this blue circular ring in the middle, this is all in calligraphy. You have these little circles that are around in sort of reddish color. Those are all calligraphy, quoting passages of scripture from the Quran. And then you also will notice that all of these arches have the alternating red and white stripes, which is inspired by Spanish Islamic architecture with the voussoirs, which we had talked about before. Especially, we saw great examples at the Great Mosque of Cordoba. And then you'll notice I have this like diagram. I think I have a close-up picture of it here. You have this large dome on top. You have the squinches, which are these connecting areas that connect the square structure on the bottom to the dome. And then within those squinches, there's several, lots of carved out niches, which are these muqarnas, and then the piers at the bottom are holding up the entire structure. This is an image of the exterior. Again, you have these arches with the voussoirs, you have these supporting columns. This is a diagram to show you what the different areas of the complex are used for. And then this is just a little bit more if you wanted to get into more detail about muqarnas. These are really fabulous examples of muqarnas that have been carved out really beautifully. And one of the things, especially when they're in a space that light is provided, like you saw in the Mosque of Selim II, or even these exterior ones, the light shines off of these niches. As the light comes in, they glitter and reflect off, which make this really beautiful glowing effect. So that's our last architectural structure from this PowerPoint, and then we'll talk more about Islamic architecture and its influences and interactions with other religions in the East in our next PowerPoint.